A 7-year-old boy just screamed, "I hate you," to his billionaire father in the middle of a crowded restaurant. Dishes are flying. Glass is breaking. Everyone's recording. But what happens next, nobody saw coming. A poor waitress does something that makes zero sense. Something dangerous. Something beautiful. And 3 years later, that little boy calls her mom. That billionaire calls her his wife. And that family? They're finally whole. This 15-minute story will wreck you in the best way possible. Don't skip ahead. Every second matters. Let me tell you about the night everything changed. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Sometimes life changes in the most unexpected moments. Let me tell you about the night that changed everything for 3 broken souls in Manhattan. Picture this. It's a Thursday evening at Sapphire, one of those fancy restaurants in New York where a single meal costs more than most people make in a week. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, soft piano music floating through the air, and wealthy people in expensive clothes pretending their lives are perfect. That's where our story begins, with the sound of shattering glass. 7-year-old Ethan Richardson threw a wine glass against the marble floor. Not by accident. No, this was pure anger, pure pain pouring out of a little boy who couldn't hold it inside anymore. Tears streamed down his red face as he screamed words that made grown men in their expensive suits step back in shock. But one person didn't move away. Her name was Sarah Bennett. She was 24 years old, just a waitress trying to make ends meet in the big city. While everyone else watched in horror or pulled out their phones to record the meltdown, Sarah did something different. She walked toward the chaos. She knelt down on that cold floor, right there among the broken glass and spilled drinks, and she got down to Ethan's level. Not above him, not looking down at him, but eye to eye, human to human. "I know your heart is hurting," she said softly. And just like that, the screaming stopped. For the first time in months, little Ethan Richardson, the son of one of America's richest and most powerful men, simply froze. He looked at this young woman, this stranger in a simple black uniform, and something inside him recognized what he'd been searching for all along. Someone who actually saw him. Not his father's money, not his family's reputation, not a problem to be fixed. Just him. A scared, lonely little boy who needed someone to care. Let me take you back a few hours earlier, before everything fell apart. The black SUV pulled up to Sapphire's entrance at exactly 7 o'clock. In the back seat, Ethan pressed his small hands against the tinted window, watching couples walk through the golden doors, laughing and holding hands. His father had promised to meet him for dinner tonight. Promised. That word meant something to 7-year-olds, even when adults had forgotten its weight. "Your father will be here soon, Ethan," said Robert, the driver and bodyguard who'd been assigned to watch the boy that evening. His voice was careful, the way everyone spoke around Ethan these days. Part respect for his father's power, part fear of the child's unpredictable temper. Ethan said nothing. He'd heard these promises before. Inside Sapphire, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation. Sarah moved between tables like a shadow, refilling water glasses, delivering plates, clearing dishes. She'd been working there for almost a year now, and she'd perfected the art of being invisible. In a place like this, invisible meant safe. Safe meant she could keep sending money back home to her sick grandmother in Ohio, the woman who'd raised her after her parents died. "Table 8 needs their drinks," called James, the head waiter, his voice sharp with the stress of a busy night. "And the couple at table 5 is asking about their appetizers again." Sarah nodded, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear. She was good at this job. Not because she loved it, but because she needed it. And because somewhere along the way, she'd learned to survive by staying quiet, staying small, staying out of the way. Then the heavy doors opened, and Robert walked in with a small figure beside him. Ethan looked like any other rich kid in his pressed navy jacket and polished shoes. But Sarah noticed something others missed. She saw the tension in his tiny shoulders, the way his dark eyes scanned the room like he was searching for someone who wasn't there, the loneliness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "Mr. Richardson's table," Robert told the manager, who immediately straightened up. Everyone in New York knew the Richardson name. Alexander Richardson, billionaire, real estate mogul, the man who seemed to own half of Manhattan. They were led to a corner table with a perfect view of the entrance. Ethan climbed into the oversized chair, his feet dangling above the floor. Robert checked his watch, frowned, and said those familiar words. "Your father will be here any minute." But Sarah, working at a nearby table, caught the look on Ethan's face. She'd seen that expression before, in her own mirror years ago. The look of a child learning not to hope too much. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Then 45. Ethan sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, watching that door like his life depended on it. Other diners began to notice, whispering behind their hands about the little boy sitting all alone. Sarah's heart ached watching him. She knew that kind of waiting, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. She approached his table carefully. "Would you like something to drink while you wait?" Ethan looked up at her with eyes far too sad for a 7-year-old. "Hot chocolate," he said quietly. "If you have it." "I'll see what I can do," Sarah smiled gently. She returned with a tall cup of hot chocolate, complete with whipped cream and a chocolate cookie on the side that she'd convinced the kitchen to spare. "The cookie's on the house," she said, setting it down. "Thank you," Ethan whispered. It might have been the first genuine kindness he'd received all day. Another 30 minutes crawled by. The hot chocolate sat untouched. The cookie remained on its plate. Ethan kept watching that door, hope dying a little more with each passing minute. At 8:15, Robert's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, and his face went grim. He walked to Ethan's table like a man heading to his own execution. "Ethan," he said carefully, "your father got held up at the office. Emergency meeting. He's very sorry and he'll make it up to you." Sarah watched from across the room as those words hit the little boy like a punch to the stomach. His face crumpled for just a second before he forced it back to neutral. But she saw it. She saw the exact moment his heart broke. "I want to go home," Ethan said, his voice small and broken. "Your father asked that you eat dinner first," Robert replied, clearly uncomfortable lying to a child. And that's when it happened. That's when everything Ethan had been holding inside just exploded. The hot chocolate cup flew first, smashing against the wall. Then the plate, then the silverware, each piece hitting the floor with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent restaurant. "I hate him," Ethan screamed. "He promised. He always promises and he always lies." People grabbed their phones. Some left their tables. Robert tried to approach, but Ethan was beyond reason now. Months of loneliness, of broken promises, of feeling invisible in his own home. All of it came pouring out. He grabbed the white tablecloth and pulled, sending everything crashing to the marble floor. Water glasses exploded. Plates shattered. The sound was deafening. "Nobody cares." Ethan sobbed, kicking at fallen chairs. "Mom left and Dad doesn't want me." Those words cut through the chaos like a knife. This wasn't a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. This was a broken little boy crying out for someone, anyone, to see his pain. And that's when Sarah moved. Not quickly, not frantically. She walked calmly through the broken glass and spilled food. And she knelt down about 3 feet away from Ethan. Close enough to reach him, far enough to give him space. "I know your heart is hurting," she said softly. Ethan froze, a bread roll still clutched in his small fist. He stared at her through tears, as if he couldn't believe someone was actually talking to him instead of about him. "Sometimes when our hearts hurt really badly," Sarah continued, her voice gentle as a whisper, "we want to break things because we feel broken inside." Ethan's breathing started to slow. The bread roll fell from his fingers. "But breaking things doesn't fix the hurt," Sarah said. "It just makes more broken pieces." "My daddy doesn't love me," Ethan whispered. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah's own eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes grown-ups are really bad at showing love. But that doesn't mean they don't feel it." Ethan searched her face, looking for lies. But Sarah's eyes were honest, kind, and free of the fear that everyone else showed around him. "Will you help me clean this up?" she asked gently. "Together?" And slowly, so slowly, Ethan nodded. Neither of them noticed the man who had just walked through the door. Alexander Richardson stood frozen in the entrance, still in his business suit, watching his son kneel on the floor beside a waitress who had just done what dozens of nannies and therapists couldn't do. She had seen Ethan. Really seen him. Not as a problem or an heir or a responsibility, but as a little boy who desperately needed someone to care. And in that moment, surrounded by broken glass and broken hearts, something began to heal. Alexander Richardson was used to commanding rooms. At 42 years old, he'd built an empire from nothing. Hotels, office buildings, luxury apartments across 3 continents. He was the man other powerful men called when they needed something done. Tall, dark-haired with streaks of gray at his temples, wearing suits that cost more than most cars, he'd perfected the art of intimidation. But standing in that restaurant doorway, watching his 7-year-old son carefully pick up broken dishes alongside a young waitress. Alexander felt something he rarely experienced. Fear. Not of enemies or business rivals, but of his own failure as a father. "Dad!" Ethan's small voice broke through his thoughts. The hope in that single word was devastating. Alexander's throat tightened. The scene before him told a story he didn't want to read. His son had been hurt, angry, desperate enough to destroy everything around him, and Alexander hadn't been there. Again. "Ethan," he said, his voice controlled but strained. "What happened here?" Sarah stood up from the floor, still holding pieces of broken glass. She could feel the shift in the room's energy. Everyone seemed to hold their breath when this man appeared. But when she looked at Alexander Richardson, she saw past the expensive suit and the intimidating presence. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides when he looked at his son, the guilt written all over his face. "It was an accident," Sarah said quietly, stepping slightly closer to Ethan in an instinctive protective gesture. Alexander's gaze shifted to her. Really looked at her for the first time. Brown hair pulled back simply, green eyes that met his without flinching, and a quiet strength that reminded him painfully of someone he tried not to think about. She was beautiful in a genuine way that had nothing to do with the artificial perfection he usually encountered. "An accident," he repeated, his tone unreadable. "Sometimes accidents happen when we're feeling big emotions," Sarah continued, her hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan was just having a hard time. The simple honesty in her words hit Alexander like a truck. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without fear or hidden agendas? When was the last time someone had defended his son instead of just managing him like a problem to be solved? "I see," Alexander said slowly. He looked around at the chaos. Overturned furniture, broken dishes, hot chocolate staining the white tablecloth. The damage was significant, but he could pay for it. What he couldn't pay for was the damage done to his son's heart. Robert approached nervously. "Mr. Richardson, I tried to—" "Wait in the car, Robert," Alexander cut him off, his eyes never leaving Ethan. As Robert retreated, Alexander moved closer. Ethan instinctively stepped back, bumping into Sarah's legs. She steadied him with gentle hands, and Alexander noticed how naturally his son leaned into her touch, how he trusted this stranger more than his own father. "Are you hurt?" Alexander asked, crouching down to Ethan's eye level. Ethan shook his head, but his lower lip trembled. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to break everything." Those words shattered something inside Alexander. His son was apologizing for having feelings, for reacting like any child would when promised something and let down again. It was exactly what Alexander himself had learned to do as a child. Hide your emotions. Apologize for needing anything. Stay small and quiet. "You don't need to apologize," Alexander said quietly, and Sarah was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "I should have been here." "You're here now," Ethan said hopefully, and Alexander's face tightened with something that looked like pain. "Yes," Alexander agreed, though they both knew it wasn't enough. It was never enough. He stood, pulling out his phone to handle what he was good at. The practical things. Paying for damages, ensuring silence, managing consequences. It was easier than dealing with emotions he didn't know how to handle. "Mr. Richardson," the restaurant manager approached nervously. "Please don't worry about the damages. These things happen." "I'll pay for everything," Alexander interrupted. "And for tonight's lost business." The unspoken message was clear. This incident would not become gossip. While Alexander handled the business side, Sarah continued helping Ethan collect the smaller pieces of debris. She noticed how the little boy kept glancing at his father, as if checking to make sure he was still there, afraid he might disappear again. "He came," Ethan whispered to her. "He actually came." "He did," Sarah agreed, her heart breaking for this child who was so grateful for the bare minimum. "Miss," Alexander's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must appear, kneeling on the floor in her simple uniform, surrounded by the mess his son had created. "Bennett," she supplied. "Sarah Bennett." "Miss Bennett," he continued, and she caught a hint of warmth beneath the formal tone. "Thank you for helping Ethan. I appreciate what you did here." There was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't used to thanking people, especially not for showing basic kindness to his child. "Any child would need help in this situation," Sarah said simply. "Ethan's a good kid. He was just overwhelmed." Alexander studied her face, searching for the calculation he was used to seeing in people. the angle, the agenda, the fear. But Sarah's expression remained open and honest, focused entirely on Ethan's well-being rather than his father's wealth or power. "Dad," Ethan tugged on Alexander's jacket. "Can Sarah eat dinner with us?" The question hung in the air. Alexander looked down at his son, then at the young woman who had somehow calmed Ethan when no one else could. "Miss Bennet is working," Alexander said carefully. "Actually," James the head waiter spoke up from behind them. He'd been watching the whole scene, and he had 3 kids of his own. He recognized something special happening here. Sarah's shift ended 20 minutes ago. Sarah shot him a surprised look, but James just smiled slightly. "Please?" Ethan asked, looking up at Sarah with hopeful eyes. "I promise I won't break anything else." Sarah glanced between father and son. Alexander looked like a man caught between wanting to give his son everything and being terrified of letting anyone too close. Ethan looked like a little boy who had found something precious and was afraid it would be taken away. Every instinct told Sarah to politely decline. But looking at Ethan's hopeful face, she found herself nodding. "Okay, just for a little while." The smile that spread across Ethan's face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And for just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw something similar flicker across Alexander's carefully controlled expression. As the restaurant staff cleaned up and reset their table, Sarah found herself sitting across from one of the richest men in America, sharing a meal with his 7-year-old son, who desperately needed someone to see him as more than just a problem. She had no idea that this simple act of kindness would change all their lives forever. The conversation started awkwardly, as these things do. But Ethan, once he felt safe, began to open up. He told Sarah about his school, about his pet hamster named Rocket, about his favorite movies and the drawings he liked to make. Alexander mostly stayed quiet, watching. Observing how Sarah listened to Ethan with genuine interest, how she asked follow-up questions, how she laughed at his jokes even when they weren't particularly funny. He watched his son come alive in a way he hadn't seen in months. "So, Miss Bennet," Alexander said eventually, his voice cutting through Ethan's excited chatter. "What brought you to New York?" Sarah hesitated, cutting her salad carefully. "Opportunity, I suppose. Better chances here than back home in Ohio." It was a non-answer, and they both knew it. "And you work multiple jobs?" Alexander asked, having noticed the tiredness around her eyes, the worn look of someone who pushed themselves too hard. "3, actually," Sarah admitted. "The restaurant, a coffee shop in the mornings, and I do bookkeeping on the side." "That's a lot of work," Alexander observed. "That's life," Sarah said simply. "I have responsibilities. My grandmother raised me after my parents died. Now she's sick and she needs help. Someone has to pay for her care." The honesty in her words struck Alexander. She wasn't working 3 jobs to buy designer clothes or live in a fancy apartment. She was surviving, supporting someone she loved, doing whatever it took. It was something he understood, even if his struggles looked different now. "My mom left," Ethan announced suddenly, his small voice matter of fact. "Dad says she had to go away, but I think she just didn't want to stay with us anymore." The silence that followed was crushing. Alexander's face went blank, and Sarah could see the pain he was trying to hide. This was clearly not a topic they'd discussed properly. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult choices," Sarah said carefully, looking at Alexander. "But that doesn't mean it's anyone's fault, especially not yours, Ethan." "That's what Dad says too," Ethan replied. "But if she loved me, wouldn't she have stayed?" The question hung there like an accusation. Alexander's hands tightened around his water glass, and Sarah could see him struggling with how to answer. "Love is complicated," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes people love us, but can't stay for reasons that have nothing to do with us. It doesn't make the love less real." Ethan seemed to consider this. "Do you think she still loves me even though she's gone?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that any mother would be incredibly lucky to have a son like you. You're kind and smart and brave. Those are the kinds of things that make people love you forever, no matter where they are." Ethan smiled, seemingly satisfied. But Alexander was looking at Sarah with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how deeply she'd just stepped into their family's pain. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "You said exactly what he needed to hear." As their food arrived and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Sarah found herself relaxing despite the surreal nature of the situation. Ethan was funny and sweet when he felt safe, and even Alexander seemed to soften as the evening progressed, the hard edges of his business persona falling away to reveal glimpses of the father underneath. By the time dessert arrived, Sarah realized something that should have terrified her. She was starting to care about these two broken people. The lonely little boy and the father who was trying so hard but didn't know how. And caring about them, she was learning, was the most dangerous thing she could do. 3 days after that dinner, Sarah was closing up at the coffee shop when a sleek black car pulled up outside. Her heart skipped when she saw Alexander Richardson step out, looking somehow even more imposing in broad daylight. "Miss Bennet," he said as she locked the door behind her. "Do you have a moment?" Sarah nodded, suddenly nervous. Had she done something wrong? Had Ethan gotten in trouble because of her? "Ethan hasn't stopped talking about you," Alexander said, getting straight to the point. "He asks about you every day. He wants to know when he'll see you again." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. "I know this is unusual," Alexander continued, "but I'd like to invite you to our home. Ethan would like to show you his room, his drawings. If you're comfortable with that." Every logical part of Sarah's brain screamed at her to say no. Getting involved with this family was crossing a line from which there'd be no going back. But the memory of Ethan's hopeful face kept pushing through her caution. "Okay," she heard herself say. "When? Saturday afternoon? I'll send a car for you at 2. That's how Sarah found herself, 3 days later, riding through the exclusive neighborhoods of Manhattan's Upper East Side. The Richardson penthouse took up the entire top floor of a building overlooking Central Park. It was stunning, but also cold, like a museum display rather than a home where a child lived. Ethan burst out as soon as she arrived, throwing his arms around her waist. "Sarah, you came. I knew you would." Behind him, Alexander stood in the doorway, dressed more casually in jeans and a dark sweater, but still somehow intimidating. "Welcome," he said, and there was warmth in his voice that hadn't been there at the restaurant. Ethan dragged her through room after room, showing her everything with childlike excitement. But Sarah noticed what was missing. No family photos. No personal touches. No evidence that real people with real emotions lived here. Ethan's room was different. Here, finally, was proof of a 7-year-old's existence. Toys everywhere, drawings taped to walls, books stacked on every surface. It was the only room that felt lived in. "This is my favorite truck," Ethan announced, showing her a bright red fire engine. "And this is where I do my drawings. And this is my bed, where I sometimes have bad dreams." The casual mention of nightmares made Sarah's chest tighten. "What kind of bad dreams?" "About Mom," Ethan said simply, sitting on his bed. "Sometimes I dream she comes back, but then I wake up and she's still gone." Sarah sat beside him. "Dreams can be confusing sometimes. Do you ever have bad dreams?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "When I was young, I used to dream about my parents after they died." "Did the dream stop?" "Eventually. But it took time." Ethan nodded seriously. "Dad has bad dreams too. Sometimes I hear him walking around at night." Before Sarah could respond, Alexander's voice came from the doorway. "Ethan, why don't you show Miss Bennet the garden? The flowers are beautiful right now." There was something in his tone that suggested he'd heard more of their conversation than he wanted to. The garden was spectacular, a private oasis in the middle of Manhattan. Ethan ran ahead to the swing set, leaving Sarah and Alexander walking side by side. "He talks to you," Alexander observed quietly, "about things he doesn't usually discuss." "Children often find it easier to talk to people who aren't directly involved," Sarah replied. "Sometimes an outside perspective feels safer." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "He's been having more nightmares lately. The therapist says it's abandonment issues." The clinical term sounded wrong coming from him, as if he were discussing someone else's child. "Have you talked to him about what happened with his mother?" Sarah asked gently. Alexander's jaw tightened. "What's there to discuss? She left. That's the end of it." "But it's not the end for Ethan," Sarah pointed out. "He's 7 years old, and he doesn't understand why his mother would choose to leave him. He's probably blaming himself." "He shouldn't," Alexander said sharply. "It wasn't his fault." "But does he know that? Really know it?" Alexander stopped walking, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Sarah thought she'd pushed too far. But when he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion she hadn't expected. "I don't know how to talk to him about it," he admitted. "I don't know how to explain something I don't understand myself." The vulnerability in his admission caught Sarah off guard. This was Alexander Richardson, a man who commanded billion-dollar deals and controlled vast wealth. But right now, he just looked like a lost father drowning in his own inadequacy. Maybe you don't need all the answers, Sarah suggested softly. Maybe you just need to let him know his feelings are valid and that you're not going anywhere. Alexander looked at her sharply. And what makes you think I'm not going anywhere? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Sarah realized she'd made an assumption based on hope rather than evidence. In Alexander's world of high-stakes business and dangerous risks, there were no guarantees. I suppose I don't know that, she said quietly. But Ethan needs to believe it. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden, with Ethan showing Sarah every flower, every tree, every corner of his world. Alexander watched from a distance, occasionally joining in but mostly observing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Ethan curled up beside Sarah on a bench, his head resting against her arm. I wish you could stay for dinner, he said sleepily. I wish I could too, Sarah said honestly. But I have to work tonight. Do you like working so much? Ethan asked. The innocent question hurt more than it should have. I work because I have to, sweetheart. But I like meeting people like you. People like me are probably pretty rare, Ethan said with 7-year-old wisdom. Very rare, Sarah agreed, kissing the top of his head. When it was time to leave, Ethan hugged her tightly, making her promise to visit again. Alexander walked her to the elevator, his expression unreadable. Thank you, he said. For today. For seeing him. Thank you for trusting me with him, Sarah replied. As the elevator descended, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Alexander. You're good for him. For us. Please come back soon. She stared at those words, her heart racing. She was crossing a line, falling for both of them. The broken little boy who needed love and the guarded man who was trying so hard to be a better father. It should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. 2 weeks later, Sarah had fallen into a rhythm. She visited the Richardson home twice a week, always in the afternoons when Ethan came home from his private school. What had started as kindness had become something deeper. She was becoming part of their lives, and they were becoming part of hers. But on a Tuesday evening, everything shattered. Sarah was closing the coffee shop when her phone rang. Unknown number. Something made her answer. Miss Bennett. The voice was tense, professional. This is Dr. Wilson from Mount Sinai Hospital. You're listed as an emergency contact for Ethan Richardson. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What happened? Is he okay? He's stable, but he was brought in about an hour ago. There was an incident at school. His father is unreachable. Can you come? Sarah didn't remember locking up or how she got to the hospital. She only remembered running, her heart pounding, terrified of what she might find. The pediatric emergency room was chaos, but she spotted Ethan immediately. He sat on an examination bed, a large bandage covering his left temple. When he saw her, his face crumpled with relief. Sarah. He reached for her, and she gathered him into her arms. I'm here, baby. I'm here. What happened? Some older kids, Ethan whispered against her shoulder. They said mean things about Dad, about our family being fake rich, about Mom leaving because she didn't want me. I got mad and pushed one of them. He pushed me back and I hit my head. Sarah's heart broke. Ethan was being bullied because of his family's visibility, because of his mother's abandonment, and he was too young to understand why other children could be so cruel. Where's your dad? She asked gently. I don't know, Ethan said, his voice small. The school called him, but he didn't come. Robert brought me here, but then he had to leave for work. Dr. Wilson appeared, a kind-faced woman. You must be Miss Bennett. Ethan's been asking for you. How is he? Minor concussion. We'd like to keep him overnight for observation. Is there any way to reach his father? Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Alexander's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. His father is in business, she said carefully. Sometimes he's difficult to reach. Dr. Wilson nodded, understanding more than her words said. Well, Ethan seems very comfortable with you. Would you be able to stay with him tonight? Of course, Sarah said without hesitation. They moved Ethan to a private room. He fell asleep holding Sarah's hand, his small fingers wrapped around hers like a lifeline. And Sarah sat there in the uncomfortable hospital chair, stroking his hair, whispering that everything would be okay. It was nearly midnight when Alexander finally appeared. Sarah looked up to see him standing in the doorway, still in his business suit but disheveled in a way she'd never seen. His hair was messed up, his tie loose, and there was something wild in his eyes that spoke of barely contained panic. How is he? He asked quietly, moving to the other side of Ethan's bed. Sleeping. Minor concussion, but he'll be okay. Sarah studied his face. Where were you? Alexander's jaw tightened. Business. I couldn't get away. He needed you, Sarah said, her voice sharper than she intended. He was hurt and scared, and you weren't there. You think I don't know that? Alexander's voice was low but intense. You think I wanted to be stuck in a board meeting dealing with a hostile takeover instead of being here with my son? The words revealed more than he probably intended. Sarah realized that Alexander's absence hadn't been a choice. It had been a necessity born of the complicated world he inhabited, where million-dollar decisions couldn't always wait, even for family emergencies. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't understand. Alexander sank into another chair, suddenly looking exhausted. No, I'm sorry. You dropped everything to be here when I couldn't. I owe you more than I can repay. They sat in silence for a while, watching Ethan sleep. Finally, Alexander spoke again. This is why Catherine left, he said quietly. My ex-wife. She couldn't handle the uncertainty. Never knowing when work would demand everything. Never knowing if our family came first or second or last. She said she couldn't raise a child in this world. But she left the child in this world, Sarah pointed out gently. Alexander's laugh was bitter. She tried to take him. I fought her for custody. 1. Maybe I was wrong to do that. Maybe he'd be better off with her, somewhere quieter, somewhere normal. Is that what you really believe? Alexander looked at his sleeping son, and Sarah saw love and fear battling in his expression. I believe that being my son comes with complications most kids never face. Ethan doesn't see complications when he looks at you, Sarah said softly. He sees his father, the person he loves most in the world. And what do you see? Alexander asked, his eyes meeting hers across the hospital bed. The question was loaded with meaning, and Sarah felt the weight of her answer. I see someone trying to be better than his circumstances, she said finally. Someone who loves his son enough to question whether that love is enough. Alexander stared at her for a long moment. You should walk away from this, from us. You're a good person, Sarah. You deserve a normal, safe life. What if I don't want normal? Sarah asked, surprising herself with her honesty. Then you don't understand what you're saying, Alexander replied. You don't know what being part of this world means. So tell me, Sarah challenged. Tell me the worst of it, and let me decide for myself. Alexander was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My father left when I was 7 years old. Same age Ethan is now. Just walked away one day and never came back. I swore I'd never do that to a child. But every day I'm terrified I'm failing Ethan the same way my father failed me. And your mother? Sarah asked gently. Died when I was 12. Depression, poverty, the weight of raising a kid alone. It broke her. Alexander's hands clenched. I learned early that love doesn't protect you from anything. It just gives you more to lose. The pieces clicked into place. Alexander's emotional distance, his struggle with showing affection, his fear of letting anyone close. It all came from a 7-year-old boy who'd been abandoned by the person who should have protected him. You're not your father, Sarah said firmly. How can you be sure? Because your father wouldn't be sitting in this hospital room at midnight, terrified he'd failed his son. Your father wouldn't care enough to question himself. Ethan stirred in his sleep, mumbling something. Both adults immediately focused on him, but he settled back down. He asked for you, Alexander said quietly. When he was hurt, when the school called, he asked for you. He asked for his father too, Sarah replied. You're the most important person in his world, Alexander. Don't let your fear make you forget that. Alexander stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the city lights. I can't promise you safety, he said without turning around. I can't promise you a normal life or a future without complications. Being part of our world means accepting risks most people never have to consider. I'm not asking for promises, Sarah said. I'm asking for honesty, and for you to stop trying to make my choices for me. Alexander turned back to face her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen before. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but real. You could walk away right now, he said. Ethan would be hurt, but he'd recover. You could go back to your safe life, find someone normal, someone who doesn't come with all this baggage. I could, Sarah agreed. But I won't. Why? Sarah looked at Ethan sleeping peacefully between them, then back at Alexander. Because that little boy has already claimed a piece of my heart. And because his father is worth the risk. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Finally, Alexander moved back to his chair, reaching across the bed to take Sarah's free hand. "If you stay," he said quietly, "you're part of this family. Both of us. And I protect what's mine." "Is that a threat or a promise?" Sarah asked. "Both," Alexander replied, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "In my world, they're often the same thing." As dawn broke over New York City, painting the hospital room in soft golden light, Sarah made her choice. She squeezed Alexander's hand and settled back in her chair, ready to face whatever came next. She was part of their family now, for better or worse. And looking at the two Richardson men who had claimed her heart, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some risks, she was learning, were worth taking. Let me tell you how this story ends. Or rather, how it begins again. 3 years later, the sound of laughter filled the garden of the Richardson home. Ethan, now 10 years old, chased his younger sister around the flower beds. Little Emma Richardson was 3, with her father's dark eyes and determined chin, and her mother's brown hair and gentle spirit. "Careful, you two," Sarah called from where she sat on the garden bench, one hand resting on her rounded belly. At 6 months pregnant with their second child, she'd learned to delegate the more energetic activities. Alexander emerged from the house, loosening his tie as he walked toward his family. At 45, he'd aged well, though there were more lines around his eyes now. Laugh lines, Sarah liked to point out. Lines earned through years of happiness he'd never expected to find. "How was your day?" Sarah asked as he settled beside her. "Long," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But better now." Ethan ran over, his school uniform grass-stained and his hair messed up. "Dad, guess what happened at school today?" "What happened?" Alexander asked, automatically checking his son for injuries. "Old habits died hard. Tommychin said his dad could beat up my dad in a business deal," Ethan announced proudly. "So I told him my dad doesn't need to prove anything because he's got better things to do. Like teaching me to play chess and helping Emma with her puzzles and making sure Mom doesn't lift heavy things." Sarah and Alexander exchanged a look over Ethan's head. In the 3 years since they'd married, Alexander had made significant changes to his life. He'd stepped back from the most demanding aspects of his business empire, delegating more, prioritizing differently. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges, but he'd kept his promise to give his family the life they deserved. "And what did Tommy say to that?" Sarah asked. "He said that sounded pretty cool, actually," Ethan grinned. "And then he asked if you could teach his dad how to make pancakes like you do on Sundays." "I think I could manage that," Sarah laughed. Emma toddled over, her small arms reaching up. "Daddy up!" Alexander lifted her easily, settling her on his lap. "Did you have a good day with Mama?" "We painted," Emma announced, "and read stories. And Mama let me help make cookies." "Did you save any for Daddy?" Alexander asked seriously. Emma giggled and nodded toward the house. "In the kitchen. But Ethan ate 3 already." "I was quality testing," Ethan protested. "Someone has to make sure they're safe for pregnant ladies and little kids." "Very responsible of you," Alexander said solemnly, though his eyes twinkled with amusement. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink, the family settled into comfortable conversation. Ethan told them about his upcoming school play. Emma babbled about her day in a mix of English and random words she'd picked up. And Sarah shared news from her weekly calls with her grandmother in Ohio. "Grandma wants to visit again soon," Sarah said. "She's threatening to fly out here by herself if we don't invite her." "She's welcome anytime," Alexander said. "Ethan needs more practice with his card games anyway. She beats him every time." "I'm getting better," Ethan protested. "Last time I almost won at Go Fish." Later, after the children were bathed and tucked into bed, Sarah and Alexander sat on their bedroom balcony, looking out over the glittering city lights. Sarah was curled against Alexander's side, his arm wrapped protectively around her. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked quietly. "Choosing this life with us?" It was a question he asked occasionally, usually when something reminded him of the risks his family faced because of who he was. "Never," Sarah said firmly. "Do you regret letting me stay that night in the hospital?" "Never," Alexander echoed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Though I still think you're brave for choosing us." "Brave or smart?" Sarah murmured. "I got the best deal possible. A husband who loves me, children who make me laugh every day, and a life full of meaning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city below. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Ethan asked me something today while you were at work." "What?" He wanted to know if the new baby would be a boy or a girl. When I said we wanted it to be a surprise, he said he hoped it would be a boy so he could teach him how to be brave like his dad. Alexander's arm tightened around her. And if it's a girl? Then he'll teach her how to be strong like her mama, Sarah finished with a smile. Either way, he's already planning to be the best big brother in the world. Alexander was quiet for a moment, processing his son's words. He thinks I'm brave. He thinks you're a hero, Sarah corrected gently. The man who protects his family and keeps them safe. The father who shows up to every school event and helps with homework and reads bedtime stories. That's the man he sees when he looks at you. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, Alexander admitted. That I get to have this. A family who loves me. Children who aren't afraid of me. A wife who sees the best in me even when I can't see it myself. Believe it, Sarah said, placing her hand over his heart. This is your life now. Our life. And it's only going to get better. From down the hall came the sound of little feet padding across the floor, followed by Ethan's voice calling softly. Mom? Dad? Emma had a bad dream. They found both children in Emma's room. Ethan was sitting on the edge of her toddler bed, gently patting her back while she sniffled into her stuffed bunny. What's wrong, sweetheart? Sarah asked, settling carefully beside the bed. Scary monster, Emma whispered. In the closet. Well, we can't have that, Alexander said seriously, moving to the closet and opening the door wide. Let's check. No monsters in here. Just clothes and toys. Maybe it's hiding, Emma said uncertainly. You know what? Ethan said importantly. Monsters are afraid of families that love each other. Dad told me that once. As long as we're all together, no monsters can get us. Is that true, Daddy? Emma asked. Alexander knelt beside the bed, his expression solemn. Absolutely true. Love is the strongest thing in the world, and this family has more love than any monster could handle. Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation, curling up under her covers with her bunny clutched tightly. Will you stay until I fall asleep? Of course, Sarah said, settling into the rocking chair beside the bed. Ethan, do you want to help me sing? As their voices blended together in a soft lullaby, Emma's eyes grew heavy. Ethan held her hand, and Alexander stood guard by the window, watching over all of them. It was a scene that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. Alexander Richardson, powerful billionaire, singing lullabies to his children while his wife rocked gently in a chair. But this was what love had done, what family had made possible. When Emma was finally asleep, they tucked Ethan back into his own bed, where he proudly showed them his latest drawing. The same stick figure family he'd drawn years ago, but now complete. The third figure was clearly Sarah, with long hair and a big smile, standing between him and his father. And now there were two more figures added. A smaller girl with curly hair labeled Emma, and another tiny figure labeled Baby. It's perfect, Sarah whispered, kissing his forehead. Just like our family. I love you, Mom, Ethan said sleepily. I love you, Dad. Thank you for making our family complete. As they turned off the lights and closed his door, Alexander caught Sarah's hand in the hallway. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For seeing him that night at the restaurant. For staying when you should have run. For loving us when we didn't know how to love ourselves. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. For making me a better man than I ever thought I could be. You did that yourself, Sarah said, reaching up to cup his face. I just reminded you who you already were underneath all that fear. I love you, Alexander said, the words still carrying the wonder of someone who'd never expected to say them and mean them so completely. I love you too, Sarah replied. All of you. Forever. As they walked back to their bedroom, past the rooms where their children slept safely, Sarah thought about that night 3 years ago, when a little boy had broken dishes and her heart in equal measure, when she'd made a choice to see past the chaos to the pain underneath, to offer kindness instead of judgment. That choice had led to this, a love deeper than she'd ever imagined, a family that had healed each other's wounds, a future bright with promise and possibility. You see, sometimes the most important moments in our lives don't look important at first. Sometimes they look like broken glass on a restaurant floor and a crying child who everyone else has given up on. Sometimes they look like taking a risk that doesn't make sense, choosing love over safety, staying when logic says to run. Sarah had knelt down beside a broken little boy and whispered, I know your heart is hurting. And in doing so, she'd healed not just his heart, but his father's too. And her own. Because in the end, that's all any of us really need. Someone to see our pain. someone to stay through the storm, someone to believe that love is stronger than fear. The Richardsons had found that in each other, and it had made all the difference. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to love someone who's forgotten how to be loved, to see potential where others see problems, to build a family not from perfection, but from broken pieces that fit together in beautiful, unexpected ways. That night, as Sarah drifted off to sleep in Alexander's arms, she smiled, because she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of ordinary magic. Ethan would probably spill his breakfast. Emma would demand the same story 3 times. Alexander would get an important work call at exactly the wrong moment. And it would all be perfectly, beautifully, wonderfully real. This was their family, built not on wealth or status or perfection, but on something far more valuable. On choosing each other every single day. On showing up even when it's hard. On believing that broken things can be made whole again with enough love and patience. And as the city lights twinkled outside their window, 3 floors above the busy Manhattan streets, the Richardson family slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Because that's what families do. Real families. The ones built not from fairy tales, but from choice and commitment and the brave decision to love each other through everything. That little boy who threw dishes in a restaurant? He grew up knowing he was loved. That guarded billionaire who didn't know how to be a father? He learned. And that waitress who saw what no one else could see. She became exactly what they needed. Not because she was perfect, but because she was willing. Willing to see. Willing to stay. Willing to believe that some broken things are worth putting back together. And in the end, isn't that what we're all looking for? Someone who will kneel down beside us when we're at our worst and whisper, "I know your heart is hurting, but I'm here, and I'm not leaving." That's the real story. Not about billionaires or fancy restaurants or dramatic rescues, but about the quiet, powerful choice to love someone enough to help them heal. To build a family from fragments. To turn pain into purpose and fear into faith. The Richardson family learned that lesson together. And they lived it every day. That's how this story ends.